I spent 3 hours screaming at my phone screen until my throat was raw, cursing the writer who dared to call that ending a tragedy when it was actually a massacre of a 5-year-old soul. I had spent months reading that novel, falling in love with the villain who was just a child in need of a hug, never imagining that the universe was listening and it was about to give me the keys to his cage. One moment I was in my dark apartment, my heart breaking for a fictional boy named Brian. The next, the smell of expensive cologne and the sterile chill of a glass and steel penthouse hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't just a reader anymore. I was standing in the designer suit of the man I hated most, the billionaire stepfather who had broken that boy before the world even had a chance to meet him. And right across the room, hiding behind a marble pillar, was Brian, trembling because I had just walked into the room. I know exactly what the original him would have done. I know because I read every chapter with my stomach in my throat. The original stepfather, the man whose designer shoes I was now wearing, would have clicked his tongue at the sight of that small, trembling silhouette, would have said something sharp and quiet, the kind of quiet that is worse than shouting, would have walked past Brian like he was furniture in a room he was already bored of. I didn't do any of that. I stood completely still in the doorway of what I could only describe as the most beautiful and most suffocating room I had ever seen in 2 lifetimes. Floor-to-ceiling windows ran along the entire north wall, offering a cityscape so vast and glittering it looked fake, like a screensaver somebody had forgotten to turn off. The furniture was all bone white and silver, sharp edges, clean lines, the kind of minimalist aesthetic that design magazines rhapsodize over, but that nobody actually wants to live inside. There were no throw pillows, no clutter, no warmth. There was a playroom to my left, and the cruelty of it stopped my borrowed heart cold. It was full of toys. Expensive, untouched, still in their boxes toys arranged on color-coded shelves, like a museum exhibit. Educational puzzles sealed in plastic wrap, building sets stacked with architectural precision, a shelf of picture books with uncracked spines. Everything a child could ever want, and not a single one of them had ever been played with, because the message in this room was, not enjoy this. The message was, be grateful and be quiet. The child behind the marble pillar made a sound so small I nearly missed it. A breath. An exhale that had been held too long. I turned very slowly, the way you move when a wild animal is watching you and you want it to know you are not going to lunge. Brian. He was so much smaller than I had imagined. 5 years old, but he carried himself like something much heavier lived inside him. Like he had already learned that the world was a place where you make yourself as compact as possible to avoid taking up space that would be resented. He was wearing a crisp little button-down shirt and perfectly pressed trousers, dressed like a doll rather than a boy, and his dark hair had been neatly parted and smoothed flat. His eyes, enormous, fathomless, the same impossible dark gray I remembered from the illustrated chapter covers, were fixed on me with an expression that carved something out of my chest and kept it. He was waiting. Waiting for me to do whatever it was the other him always did when he walked through that door. I'm not him. The thought roared through me with a ferocity that surprised even me. Please, little one, don't look at me like I'm the monster under your bed. But I couldn't say that. Not yet. Not when the word stepfather sat in this child's vocabulary like a synonym for danger. Any sudden warmth from me would read as a trick. 5-year-olds who have learned to flinch know that smiles can precede cruelty. I had read every chapter. I knew exactly what this boy had been conditioned to expect. So I did the only safe thing I could think of. I sat down. Right there, on the cold marble floor of the penthouse entryway, in what was almost certainly a $3,000 suit, and I sat with my back against the wall and said nothing, just brought myself down to his level, down to a height that wasn't looming, wasn't blocking the exit, wasn't threatening. Brian stared at me from behind his pillar. I looked at the city through the window and pretended I was just resting. The silence stretched. I let it. I had no agenda for the next 60 seconds except to be a person who was sitting on the floor and not frightening anyone. I had read enough to know that you cannot rush a child who has been taught that trust is a trap. You just have to exist peacefully in their radius until they recalibrate. It took 4 minutes. I know because I counted. Then, with the painstaking slowness of a creature approaching the edge of a dangerous thing, Brian peered out from behind the pillar. Just his face, just enough to see me fully. I didn't look directly at him. I kept my eyes on the window. "The lights down there," I said, to nobody in particular, "look like they're breathing, don't they?" It wasn't a question. It was just a sound. A non-threatening human sound in a room that had probably never had one before. Another silence. Then, barely above a whisper, "They change colors." My heart cracked clean in half, not dramatically, not theatrically. It just quietly fractured along a line I hadn't known was there until that moment. The line where a child who has been told to be silent chooses, despite every reason not to speak. "Yeah," I said softly, "they do." I didn't push further. I sat for another few minutes, and then I excused myself to find the master bedroom. And once the door was closed behind me, I sat on the edge of what was probably the most expensive mattress on earth and held my own face in my hands and breathed. "Okay." I pressed the heels of my palms against my eyes. "Okay. You're here. You're real. This is happening." The body I was in had muscle memory. The walk, the posture, the way the suit jacket sat on shoulders broader than my own original ones. I was tall in this body, imposing. I could feel it in the way the household staff had averted their eyes when I'd passed through the lobby, in the way the elevator doors had seemed to open faster than necessary, in the rigid deference of the single housekeeper who had bowed at a precise angle and said, "Welcome home, Mr. Voss." Mr. Voss. That was me now, apparently. The original Mr. Voss, whose name I was only now, retroactively, filling in from the novel's text, had been cultivated over years into something fine-edged and destructive, born into a different kind of wealth, married into this one, ambitious, image-obsessed, deeply resentful of the stepchild who was a living reminder that his husband had a past that did not include him. The novel had never been fully explicit about what happened between the original him and Brian. It didn't need to be. The results were legible on a 5-year-old who stood behind pillars and waited to be hurt. I was not going to be that person. I didn't know how long I had in this body, if transmigration came with an expiration date, if the plot was a river I could divert or only slightly redirect. I didn't know what consequences my changes would ripple outward into. I only knew what I had left behind in my dark apartment, the image of an adult Brian in the novel's final arc, who had become everything the world called a villain and I called a wound. Cold, cruel, incapable of being reached. A man who had learned at 5 years old that no one was coming and had built his entire empire on that lesson. I was not going to let that happen. I pushed off the bed and went looking for the kitchen. It took me longer than I would like to admit. The penthouse was genuinely labyrinthine. Multiple wings, corridors lined with art I recognized as outrageously valuable, a home office behind a glass wall that looked like a smaller version of a corporate headquarters, a dining room with a table that could seat 12 in a home occupied by 2. I found the kitchen eventually, a sleek, professional space that smelled of nothing because nothing had been cooked in it recently. There was a housekeeper named Mrs. Cho who appeared from somewhere and offered to prepare dinner and looked mildly alarmed when I asked her what Brian usually ate. She blinked, like the question was in a foreign language. The young master eats his meals in the East dining room. At 6 o'clock, the menu is prepared by chef on a rotating schedule approved by... "What does he like?" I interrupted, gently but clearly. "Not the approved menu. What does Brian actually like to eat?" Mrs. Cho stared at me for a moment with an expression I would later come to understand was her recalibrating everything she thought she knew about the household dynamic. He asked for pancakes once," she said finally, in a tone that suggested this memory had been filed away as an anomaly. "Last spring, but the original menu does not include." "Can we make pancakes tomorrow morning?" I asked. She stared. "Yes," she said, after a pause so long it had its own weather system. "Of course, sir." I thanked her and went back to the main living area where the city was doing its breathing light show through the windows and the white furniture cast shadows like bones. I stood in the middle of it and thought about what a home needed to feel like and cataloged everything this one was missing. Soft things, color, the smell of food, the sound of something other than air conditioning, proof that someone lived here instead of just maintained a presence. I was still standing there, taking inventory of everything I needed to change, when I heard the small sound behind me. Brian had come out from the east wing. He stood in the corridor entrance in pajamas now, white, of course, pristine and matching, and he was watching me with those enormous gray eyes. He'd clearly been sent to bed by someone, the nanny perhaps, and had come back out for reasons he probably couldn't have articulated. I turned to look at him fully, and I kept my expression completely neutral, calm, non-reactive. The way you hold yourself when you want to communicate nothing you do here is going to be a problem. He pointed, very tentatively, at the window. "They're doing the blue ones now," he whispered. I turned to look. He was right. The city had shifted into its blue hour palette, the office towers cycling through their evening light sequences. "They are," I agreed. I sat back down on the floor, on the cold marble, in the expensive suit, and after a moment that felt like a held breath at the edge of a cliff, Brian came and sat down next to me, not touching, a careful negotiated distance, but next to me. We watched the city breathe blue together for almost 20 minutes, and he didn't say another word, and I didn't either, and it was the closest thing to a beginning I had ever been handed. "You don't have to earn my kindness, Brian," I thought, watching the lights shift to gold. "You were born deserving it. I just have to find a way to make you believe that." I had to, because somewhere in this city, a car was moving through the dark in the direction of this penthouse. A long, black, expensive car, carrying a man in a colder suit than mine, with colder eyes than the marble floor. The CEO father. The man the novel had described as the architect of his own son's loneliness, not out of malice, but out of an emotional vacancy so deep and so practiced it had calcified into a personality. Alaric was coming home, and when he did, everything was going to change. I heard him before I saw him. The penthouse had a particular silence to it, the absence of sound that money engineers deliberately, triple-glazed glass and sound-dampened walls, and the soft architecture of wealth that keeps the world at a permanent remove. So when the private elevator chimed at 11:43 p.m. and the doors slid open to admit Alaric Voss, the sound of his footsteps on the marble was precise and deliberate, like a metronome set to a tempo that did not negotiate. I was in the kitchen. I had made tea I didn't want because it gave my hands something to do, and I had been standing there in the dark for the better part of an hour since Brian had finally been coaxed back to bed by Mrs. Cho. I didn't go out to meet him. I heard his footsteps pause in the main hall, a brief silence, the kind that means a person has registered something out of place. Then the footsteps resumed, and the kitchen light came on, and Alaric Voss walked into the room and stopped when he saw me. And my entire borrowed nervous system shorted out. I had read his descriptions, obviously. The novel had not been stingy with them. Architectural beauty, cold as marble, twice as hard. The kind of person who makes you feel by sheer proximity that you have been poorly assembled. But reading those descriptions and actually standing in the same room as the source material were exercises in completely different categories of experience. He was tall, taller than this body I occupied, and this body was already taller than I'd been in my original life. He wore a charcoal suit that probably came from somewhere that required a passport to reach, and it sat on him with the specificity of something that had been made for his exact geometry. Dark hair, pushed back slightly from a face that was all clean angles and deliberate symmetry. The kind of face that would be beautiful if it had ever practiced an expression that wasn't controlled. His eyes were the problem. They were light, a pale, particular gray that the novel had called winter light in one of its more indulgent moments, and that I had thought was romantic hyperbole, and that I now understood had been straight reportage. They were striking in the way a very still body of water is striking, reflective, calm on the surface, and absolutely communicating nothing about what was underneath. Those eyes moved over me with the systematic efficiency of a man reviewing a document for inconsistencies. "You're awake," he said. It wasn't a greeting. It wasn't particularly anything. It was an observation delivered in a voice that had clearly been educated at institutions where emotion was considered a liability. "I made tea," I said, because I needed to say something, and what I actually wanted to say was, "You left your 5-year-old son alone with a monster and you didn't even know." And I was saving that for a moment when I wasn't still recalibrating to his face. Something shifted microscopically in his expression. Not surprise. Alaric Voss didn't do surprise publicly, but something adjacent to it, a recalibration. "Brian?" he said. "Asleep," I said. "Finally." He crossed to the coffee machine with movements so economical they were almost meditative, and began making himself something with the automated efficiency of a man who has performed this action 10,000 times and derived nothing from it except function. "You were with him this evening?" Not a question. "I was." "Mrs. Cho mentioned he ate dinner in the main room." A pause. "That's not usual." "I know," I said. "I changed it." The coffee machine finished. He picked up the cup and turned to face me across the brushed steel countertop, and the distance between us, maybe 6 feet of brushed steel countertop, felt both too much and nowhere near enough. He looked at me over the rim of his cup with those winterlight eyes and said nothing. The silence had a texture to it, dense, expectant, the kind that has a question in it that neither party has technically asked yet. "You've been different," he said. 3 words, delivered with the flatness of a clinical observation. But I had read enough chapters to understand that Alaric Voss communicating anything that wasn't a business directive was the emotional equivalent of a controlled detonation. Enormous energy, very carefully managed, and still capable of taking out everything in a certain radius. They were light, a pale, particular gray that the novel had called winter light in one of its more indulgent moments, and that I had thought was romantic hyperbole, and that I now understood had been straight reportage. They were striking in the way a very still body of water is striking, reflective, calm on the surface, and absolutely communicating nothing about what was underneath. Those eyes moved over me with the systematic efficiency of a man reviewing a document for inconsistencies. "You're awake," he said. It wasn't a greeting. It wasn't particularly anything. It was an observation delivered in a voice that had clearly been educated at institutions where emotion was considered a liability. "I made tea," I said, because I needed to say something, and what I actually wanted to say was, "You left your 5-year-old son alone with a monster and you didn't even know." And I was saving that for a moment when I wasn't still recalibrating to his face. Something shifted microscopically in his expression. Not surprise. Alaric Voss didn't do surprise publicly, but something adjacent to it, a recalibration. "Brian?" he said. "Asleep," I said. "Finally." He crossed to the coffee machine with movements so economical they were almost meditative, and began making himself something with the automated efficiency of a man who has performed this action 10,000 times and derived nothing from it except function. "You were with him this evening?" Not a question. "I was." "Mrs. Cho mentioned he ate dinner in the main room." A pause. "That's not usual." "I know," I said. "I changed it." The coffee machine finished. He picked up the cup and turned to face me across the brushed steel countertop, and the distance between us, maybe 6 feet of brushed steel countertop, felt both too much and nowhere near enough. He looked at me over the rim of his cup with those winterlight eyes and said nothing. The silence had a texture to it, dense, expectant, the kind that has a question in it that neither party has technically asked yet. "You've been different," he said. 3 words, delivered with the flatness of a clinical observation. But I had read enough chapters to understand that Alaric Voss communicating anything that wasn't a business directive was the emotional equivalent of a controlled detonation. Enormous energy, very carefully managed, and still capable of taking out everything in a certain radius. "Good," I said. His eyes moved to mine directly. It was the first time he had fully held my gaze, and the experience was disorienting in a way I did not have appropriate vocabulary for. It was like being looked at by something that was deciding whether you were a variable or a constant. "Not a judgment," he said. "An observation." "Either way," I said, "the answer is the same." He set his coffee cup down, leaned one hand on the counter with a studied casualness that I recognized from the novel's narration as his version of letting his guard down, almost imperceptible, almost nothing, but there. "The nannies," he said. "I'm reviewing the arrangements," I said evenly. Something shifted in the architecture of his expression. Not quite a frown, his face didn't do anything so readable, but a tightening along the jaw, a slight contraction of the space between his brows. "They're efficient," he said. And that was what broke it open. Not loudly. I didn't raise my voice. I had Brian asleep 2 wings away, and I was not the kind of person who performed anger for its own sake. But I set my tea mug down with a precision that was its own kind of statement, and I looked at Alaric Voss across his own immaculate kitchen, and I said, "He's your son, Alaric, not a corporate asset." I kept my voice level and clear. "Do you know what he had for breakfast this morning? Do you know what books he likes? Do you know that he hides behind the marble pillar in the main hall because it's the only place in this penthouse where he has ever felt like something large was about to hit him?" The silence that followed was different in quality from the ones before it. Alaric stood perfectly still. His expression hadn't changed, or rather, it was working very hard at not changing, which in someone with his level of self-control was practically the same as watching him fracture. "That's a significant accusation," he said quietly. "It's an observation," I returned, borrowing his own phrasing back at him. "Look at how thin he is, Alaric. When was the last time you actually looked at his face instead of his school reports?" Something moved in those winter-light eyes, something that had the shape of a response being suppressed, re-evaluated, and suppressed again. He turned away from me and picked up his coffee. "The nanny arrangement," he said in a voice that was doing extraordinary work at being neutral, "has functioned without incident for—" "Without incident?" I repeated. "Brian spent 20 minutes tonight sitting on the floor of the main hall watching city lights because it was the first time all day he had been in the same space as another human being who wasn't directing him to do something or be somewhere. He's 5 years old. Without incident is the floor, Alaric, not the bar." He faced me again. And this was the moment I had not been prepared for, because the novel had described it once, and I had read it once, and I had not understood what it meant until I was inside it. Alaric Voss, when something actually reached him, did not show it in his expression. He showed it in his stillness. He became so motionless that the air around him seemed to stop moving like something enormous had decided to hold its breath. He was holding his breath now. "What do you want?" he said. Not unkindly, just genuinely. Effortfully asking, as though he had the language for negotiating contracts and redirecting boardrooms, but the vocabulary for this specific kind of conversation had been stored somewhere he couldn't currently locate. Alaric's jaw moved. "I'm not finished." I wasn't unkind about it either, just clear. "If you want a subordinate, go back to your boardroom. If you want a family, start acting like you have a heart." The kitchen held us both in its fluorescent stillness. I watched him, and he watched me, and the expression on his face, so carefully controlled, so practiced in its containment, was doing something that his control was not quite able to prevent. He looked for a fleeting and quickly sealed moment, like a man who had just been told the truth about something he had been very successfully not knowing. "You've never spoken to me like this before," he said. "I know," I said. "Why now?" I thought about Brian on the marble floor, Brian whispering about the blue lights, Brian's shoulders carrying the careful, compact posture of a child who has learned to take up as little space as possible. "Because somebody had to," I said. He looked at me for a long moment, For a man whose face gave nothing away, the fact that he was still looking, still here, still engaged, not having closed the conversation with a single blade-precise sentence and walked away, was a kind of communication I was only beginning to understand the grammar of.
"He isn't afraid of the dark, Alaric," I said, softer now, because I was tired, and the night was late, and somewhere down the hall there was a small boy who deserved better from both of us. "He's afraid of the people who are supposed to love him in the light." Alaric set his coffee cup down. He didn't say anything, but he didn't leave either. He stood in his own kitchen with his jacket still on and his tie still perfectly knotted at midnight. And he looked at the middle distance for a moment, and then he looked back at me with something in his expression that had not been there before, something I didn't have a clean word for yet, but that registered in the base of my sternum like a frequency shift. He wasn't looking at the documents anymore. He was looking at me, with a hunger that had nothing to do with business, and everything to do with the fire I'd just lit in his cold house. "Good night," I said, before either of us could reckon with what that look contained. I picked up my tea mug and walked past him toward the corridor, and I felt his gaze follow me the entire length of the kitchen, steady and particular and entirely new. The nannies left on a Tuesday. I didn't fire them cruelly. I'm not built for cruelty, which was going to be an ongoing logistical challenge in the body of a man whose reputation had been built on it. I simply called a household meeting and explained in clear and specific terms that the protocols governing Brian's daily schedule were being revised, and that the revised protocols prioritized his emotional comfort over his performance metrics, and that anyone who found this incompatible with their professional approach was welcome to submit their notice with full severance. 2 of the 3 nannies submitted their notice. The third, a quiet woman in her 50s named Miss Park, who had, it turned out, already been filing private notes to an agency about her concerns regarding Brian's environment. She showed them to me when I asked, and I had to walk out of the room for a minute and stand in the corridor and breathe, because what she had documented was not abuse in any visible, nameable way. It was absence, pure, calibrated, expensive absence. And absence in a 5-year-old's nervous system does its own kind of damage. "You'll have help," I told her when I came back. "Whatever you need." She looked at me for a moment in the way that Miss Cho had looked at me when I asked about pancakes, like she was processing a significant recalibration, and then she nodded. "I ordered things. I ordered them from my phone sitting on the floor of Brian's room while he slept, scrolling through children's goods with a single-minded urgency that I think the platform's algorithm found alarming because it kept suggesting I might want to slow down. I did not want to slow down. I wanted blankets in yellow and blue and a deep, soft green. I wanted storybooks that were warped from being read too many times. I wanted craft supplies in colors the original Penthouse had apparently decided were aesthetically incompatible with its color scheme. I wanted a rug for the playroom that looked like grass. The boxes arrived over the next 2 days, and I unpacked every single one of them myself. Brian watched me from the doorway. This had become his mode, surveillance from a careful distance, tracking what I was doing with those enormous gray eyes, not yet willing to be in the room with me, but no longer hiding behind pillars to do his watching. I counted it as measurable progress and did not comment on it. I just let him watch me wrestle a grass-green rug into position in the playroom and arrange the soft blankets on the reading corner I had assembled in the corner window seat. And when I was done, I sat back on my heels and looked at the room and thought, better. Not good yet, but better, warmer, possible. "Do you want to put the books on the shelf?" I asked without turning around. A pause. "How?" "However you want," I said. "They're your books. You could put them by color or by size, or just throw them in any order and see what looks right." Another pause, longer. Then small footsteps crossed the threshold of the playroom, and Brian came and crouched beside the box of books, and for the next 45 minutes we arranged them together without speaking, and it was the most peace I had found since arriving in this life. That evening, I made grilled cheese sandwiches in the kitchen while Mrs. Cho watched with the expression of someone witnessing a violation of physics. The bread was the expensive kind, sourdough from a bakery that delivered, and the cheese was something artisan that I cut myself because the kitchen had a knife block that looked like it had never been used for anything so domestic. I made 2 sandwiches,
and cut them diagonally because that is the correct way to cut a grilled cheese sandwich, and I brought them to the small table by the kitchen window where I had been having Brian's dinners moved since the first night. Brian ate his entire sandwich. He ate it quickly, hunched slightly over the plate in the manner of a child who has learned to eat fast because meals are not always guaranteed to be peaceful. I noticed this, and I noted it in the private ledger I was keeping in my head under the column labeled Things to Undo, which was getting long. "Did you like it?" I asked. He looked up, thought about it seriously in the way small children consider questions they have not been asked very often. "Yes," he said, and then, very carefully, like he was testing whether the floor would hold, "Can we have them again?" "As many times as you want," I said. He nodded, went back to his plate. I looked out the window at the city and felt something cautiously, tentatively, like hope. Alaric started coming home earlier. He never said this directly. He did not announce schedule changes or explain himself. He was simply there, suddenly at 9 p.m. instead of midnight, or at 8:30, standing in the corridor in his suit with his briefcase, watching the kitchen window light up with the sounds of Brian and me failing to make proper pancake batter because Brian had decided to try mixing it himself and had gotten flour on everything. I noticed him standing there the third time it happened. I didn't say anything about it. I just handed Brian a clean dish towel and started wiping down the counter, and when Alaric finally walked into the kitchen, I looked up at him and said, "There's batter left if you want to make one." He looked at the flour on the counter, at Brian, who had frozen with his dish towel mid-wipe and was watching Alaric with the particular vigilance of a child who has not yet decided if a new behavior represents a real change or a temporary anomaly. "I don't cook," Alaric said. "Nobody does the first time," I said. "Brian's on his fourth attempt. He's getting better. Right, Brian?" Brian looked between us. His small hands tightened slightly on the dish towel. Then, "The first one's burned," he said, quietly, addressing the air roughly between us as a compromise. "But the last one wasn't burned." Alaric went very still in the way I was beginning to recognize. "I see," he said. He didn't make a pancake, but he also didn't leave. He stood at the edge of the kitchen for a few minutes, jacket on, briefcase set by the door, hands in his pockets, and watched us finish. And when Brian held up his completed but extremely imperfect pancake for approval, I watched Alaric's face do something that his face was apparently not accustomed to doing. The corner of his mouth moved. Just fractionally. Just enough to be visible if you were watching for it. "For a man who owns half the city," I said when Brian had gone to the table and was applying an aggressive amount of syrup, "you're remarkably poor at the things that actually matter." Alaric's eyes moved to mine. "What matters," he said, "in your assessment?" "That," I said, gesturing toward Brian and his catastrophic syrup situation. Alaric looked at his son for a long moment. He stopped, recalibrated. "I haven't seen him speak that easily before." "I know," I said, without any sharpness in it, just fact. Another silence, a different quality from the ones in the kitchen 2 weeks ago. Less charged, less defensive, but somehow more intimate, the way a room feels different once the furniture has been rearranged. "Stop looking at me like a puzzle you can't solve, Alaric," I said, soft enough that Brian couldn't hear. "I'm just a man who cares about your son. Why is that so hard for you to understand?" He held my gaze for 3 full seconds, which, from Alaric Voss, was the equivalent of a sonnet. "I don't know," he said, and I believed him because he said it the way people say things they haven't admitted to themselves yet. Brian's fever came fast, the way fevers do in small children. 1 hour he was fine, and the next he was burning, curled up in his bed with his eyes half open and his cheeks red and his breathing shallow in the particular way that makes a responsible adult's entire nervous system go onto emergency alert. It was 2 in the morning. I had already called the household doctor. I had already changed Brian into lighter pajamas with the very careful negotiation that changing clothes requires when a child is sick and everything feels overwhelming. I had already gotten a damp cloth for his forehead and a glass of water with a straw, because straws make everything more manageable when you are 5 years old and miserable. And I was sitting on the edge of Brian's bed with my hand near, but not on his, because he hadn't yet extended that particular permission, when the door opened. Alaric stood in the doorway. He was not in his suit. He was in a dark shirt and trousers, what I assumed passed for casual in his wardrobe. And his hair, for the first time since I had arrived in this life, was not perfectly arranged, like he had been awake before this, doing something that required concentration, and had come from that directly. He looked at Brian, then at me. I said quietly, "The doctor is coming at 2:30. It's a standard fever. He's going to be fine." "I know." He came into the room without asking permission. His house, his son, he didn't need to ask, and stood on the other side of Brian's bed and looked down at his son in the manner of a man who is doing something unfamiliar with his own body and watching himself do it with a kind of suspended bewilderment. Brian's eyes opened. He looked at his father. Neither of them said anything. Then Brian looked at me, and something in him settled. I reached for the damp cloth to freshen it, and at the same moment Alaric reached for Brian's blanket to straighten it, and his hand brushed mine, just for a second, just at the edge of contact. And for a moment the air in the room felt like it was charged with enough electricity to burn the whole penthouse down. We both went very still. Brian had already drifted back into the light sleep of the ill, and the room was silent except for his breathing and the distant sound of the city outside the triple-glazed windows. Alaric and I looked at each other across his sleeping son. "Come," I said, eventually. "I'll make coffee. The doctor will be here soon." The kitchen at 3 in the morning was a different place than the kitchen at any other hour. The city lights were lower and the room felt smaller, and the silence was the kind that is not uncomfortable but honest, the kind that exists between two people who are too tired for performance. I made coffee. Alaric sat at the kitchen table, actually sat, not stood at the counter with his jacket on, but sat, with both hands wrapped around a mug. And for a long time, neither of us spoke. "I didn't know," he said, finally. I looked at him. "About the way he was—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "About the way things were before." "I know. That's not an excuse. I know that too." He looked into his coffee. "He has always been— I haven't known how to—" Another stop. Alaric Voss, I was learning, was a man with an enormous interior life that had never been given adequate infrastructure for expression. "He's very quiet." I said, "He learned to be." From what? From understanding that being loud wasn't safe. The silence that followed had a different quality, the kind that follows the answer to a question the asker wasn't sure they wanted answered. I'm not a patient man. I know that. I've always— the way I work, the way I think, it doesn't translate to— He gestured, a small uncharacteristic gesture toward the direction of Brian's room. "This." "You don't have to be patient," I said. "You just have to be present. Those are different things." He looked at me. "Present," he repeated. "Awake, in the room, not on your phone, not mentally in the boardroom, just there, for him." I wrapped my hands around my own mug. He doesn't need a perfect father. He needs a father who shows up. Alaric was quiet for a long time. "He looked at you," he said. "When he woke up, he looked at you first, and then he settled. He relaxed because you were there." "Yes," I said. "He's never done that with me." "Not yet," I said, "but he will, if you let him." Alaric looked at me with those winter-light eyes in the 3 a.m. kitchen, and the expression in them was something I did not have a clean name for yet. It was complicated and searching, and had layers that I did not know how to fully read. But I knew what was not in it. The coldness, the managerial distance, the sense of a man processing a human interaction as a logistical problem. He was just looking at me, directly. The way people look at each other when the defenses are down and the hour is too late for anything except the truth. Why do you care about him this much? He's not—" He stopped himself. "He's not mine biologically," I finished, without making it an accusation. "I know." "That's not what I know what you were going to say," I said. "And the answer is that I don't think love works on bloodlines. I think it works on presence, on choosing, on showing up at 2 in the morning when a 5-year-old has a fever." I met his eyes, which you did, so maybe you already know how this part works. Something in his face did a thing that I was fairly certain Alaric Voss had not allowed his face to do in the presence of another adult in a very long time. He looked for one unguarded and quickly recovered moment, lost. Not in a bad way, in the way that means someone has just arrived somewhere they weren't expecting and are taking their bearings. The doctor arrived at 3:30. Brian's fever broke by 4. I stayed in his room until his breathing went deep and even. And when I came back to the kitchen, Alaric was gone, but there were 2 clean coffee mugs in the drying rack. He had washed both of them. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the drying rack for a long moment and felt something warm move through me that I did not examine too closely because I had a child to protect and a household to run, and there was no room yet for what was trying to quietly begin. The Harlow Foundation Gala was the kind of event that existed primarily to remind people exactly where they stood in the hierarchy of a certain kind of world. Black tie, invitation only, held in the kind of venue that charges more per square foot than some people's mortgages, populated entirely by people who had enough money that they had moved past the stage of wanting it and were now simply using it as a score in a game whose rules nobody ever wrote down. I had not wanted to go. I had expressed this to Alaric clearly and without apology. "Brian has been settling. I don't think it's a good time to disrupt the schedule with a formal event." Alaric had looked at me across the dinner table, Brian between us, eating the pasta I'd made from a recipe Miss Park had found on a cooking website, making small, pleased sounds that still had the power to undo me completely, and said, in his measured way, "The Harlows are business critical. Your absence would be read as a statement." "My presence will be read as a statement too. I just want to choose which one." He had looked at me for a moment and then said, "We'll take Brian to Miss Park. 2 hours. I'll have you home before 9. "We." He had said "we" without appearing to notice. I had gone. The gala was exactly what I had expected. Beautiful, expensive, and held at a temperature approximately 5 degrees colder than was comfortable, as though the venue was specifically designed to make guests feel that warmth was for people who hadn't been invited. I wore something from the wardrobe of the man whose life I'd inherited. Black, perfectly fitted, the kind of formal wear that communicates its cost through what it doesn't do rather than what it does. Alaric walked beside me. He was— there is no more articulate word for this— devastating in formal wear. Whatever the corporate suit did, the black tie undid. He moved through the room the way a current moves through water, purposefully, with the certainty of something that does not require the room to rearrange itself for it, because the room simply does, as a matter of physics. People looked at him and then at me, and then calibrated. I noticed this. I also noticed that Alaric stood close, closer than I had expected, closer than was strictly required by the social geometry of the room, and that when someone greeted us and said "us" in the way people say "us" about a couple, he did not correct them. The trouble started at 40 minutes in. A man named Cromwell, Helena Harlow's brother-in-law, precisely the type the novel had categorized as social predator with good tailoring, found us by the bar and spent approximately 6 minutes demonstrating why he likely would have been universally disliked at every school he had ever attended. He was charming in the technical sense, the sense that requires no actual warmth, and he directed most of his conversation at Alaric while consistently and deliberately referring to me in the diminutive, not by name, not by any role, but as your arrangement and the domestic situation and, most deliberately, the one managing the child. I held my champagne glass and let it go for 4 of the 6 minutes. Then Cromwell made the mistake of saying, with his practiced social smile, that it was refreshing, in a way, that Alaric had found someone to manage the Voss legacy situation, and that he hoped the child was getting the structure he needs, given the stock he comes from. I set my champagne glass down on a passing tray. Brian, I said, pleasantly, into a pocket of quiet that had formed around us, is a thoughtful, curious, brilliant child who recently demonstrated to me that he can identify 17 species of bird from their calls because he spent 2 weeks quietly teaching himself from a library book. He learned the book existed because he asked me what the bird outside his window was called, which was the first spontaneous question he had asked anyone in what his previous caregivers described as quite some time. I met Cromwell's eyes with complete even-handedness. The stock he comes from, as you put it, includes his father, who built his current enterprise from a company that was hemorrhaging capital when he inherited it, and his mother, whom I understand was one of the sharpest legal minds of her generation. If you're keeping score, I'd say Brian has a considerable head start. Cromwell's smile did not change, but something behind it did. "Well," he said. "Quite," I agreed. I turned to get a new glass of water, I was done with champagne, and became aware, in the particular way you become aware of heat from a nearby flame, that Alaric was looking at me. I glanced at him. His expression was the controlled one, the winter light one, but his eyes were doing the thing they had started doing in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, holding more than the surface allowed for, a depth of attention that had nothing managed about it. "Excuse us," Alaric said, with the finality of a closed file, and his hand came to the small of my back, light, certain, brief, as he guided me 2 steps away from the conversation. The touch lasted approximately 3 seconds. I thought about it for the rest of the evening. Later, after the requisite speeches, after the air kisses and the business cards, and the perfectly calibrated social performances of 100 people who were all exhausted by them, we stood near the car, waiting for the driver, and the night air was cool, and the city was doing its usual breathing light routine, and Alaric said without preamble, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," I said. "You chose to." "He was talking about Brian," I said. "Brian, who is home right now in his blue and yellow blanket, probably asking Miss Park to read him the bird book one more time. Brian, who is going to grow up knowing his worth regardless of what men like Cromwell decide it is." I looked at the city. "Yes, I chose to because he is my son, too." A pause. "He's lucky," Alaric said. I turned to look at him. In the dark outside the venue, with the event lights behind him and the city spread beyond, he looked different, undone slightly, not cold, not managed, just a man standing in the night, close enough that I could see the precise gray of his eyes even in low light. "He's lucky," he continued, and his voice was doing something careful, something that had the quality of a person saying a thing they've thought about for weeks and only just decided to say out loud. "I'm not good at this." "I know," I said, for what felt like the 100th time, but this time with something different in it, something gentler, something that acknowledged the effort. "I've been coming home earlier," he said. "I noticed." "Not for work." "I know that too." He looked at me directly, and the look was, I don't have words in any of the languages I know for the specific quality of being looked at by Alaric Voss when he's stopped managing himself and is simply, nakedly present. It was like standing in front of a window that had been shuttered for years and suddenly finding it open. All that light, all that cold, particular, real light. "I don't know what this is. What I don't have the language for." "You don't need the language yet," I said, softly. "We have time." He was quiet. "Brian first, always. He needs to feel safe before anything else can be, before we can even think about what anything else is, okay?" Something moved through Alaric's expression, something that had been shored up for a very long time and was deciding, carefully and incrementally, whether it was safe to put some of the weight down. "Okay," he said. It was the most open I had ever heard his voice. When we got home, Brian was not asleep. He was on the couch in the main room in his blue and yellow blanket, the bird book open on his lap, Miss Park asleep in the armchair beside him with admirable dedication. Brian looked up when we came in, at Alaric first, then at me, performing his usual threat assessment, and then he did something that made the whole evening worth every minute of Cromwell and the cold champagne and the weight of standing in a room full of people who did not know Brian's name. He lifted the corner of the blanket. Just the corner. Just enough. An offering. It was directed almost equally at both of us. Alaric looked at the blanket, at Brian, at me. I sat down on the couch on Brian's left side and tucked myself under the offered corner of the blanket like it was the most natural thing in the world. And I looked at Alaric across the small expanse of the couch until he crossed the room and sat on Brian's right side, and Brian pulled the blanket more firmly around all three of us with the satisfied authority of a 5-year-old who has decided that a thing is correct. "There's a bird called a murmuration," Brian said, opening his book to a page near the middle. "It's not really a bird, it's when starlings fly together, like thousands of them, and it looks like," he turned the page to a photograph, "like the sky is breathing." "Like the city lights," I said. He looked up at me. "Yeah, like the city lights." Alaric leaned slightly over Brian's head to look at the photograph, and his shoulder was warm against mine in the way that real, living warmth always is, specific and particular, and nothing like the cold surfaces of the penthouse that had tried to convince me for weeks that this family was made of marble. It wasn't. It was made of this: a boy with a bird book, a blanket that was the right colors, a man learning how to put his weight down, and me, not the monster anymore, not the wicked stepfather, not the man in the expensive suit who had walked through that door and frightened a child into a pillar. Just a person who had chosen this, who kept choosing it. Brian fell asleep between us 40 minutes later, the bird book sliding off his lap, his head finding the space between my shoulder and the couch with the boneless trust of a child who has, at some point in the last several weeks, quietly recategorized the world as a place where this is possible. I didn't move. Alaric didn't move either. We sat in the glow of the city through the windows, and at some point his hand found mine on the cushion beside Brian's sleeping form, not a grand gesture, not announced, just his hand finding mine the way one warm thing finds another in a room that has finally stopped being cold. And I let it. "You were born deserving this," I thought, looking at Brian's sleeping face. "Both of you were." Outside the windows, the city breathed its slow, colored light, and for the first time since I'd arrived in this borrowed life, in this glass and steel world I was slowly teaching to be a home, I felt something I had not allowed myself to name until now. Safe. Not the child yet, not fully, not forever, not without the long road of healing still ahead, but beginning. Beginning was enough. Beginning was everything. The end.